Welcome back to the deep dive. Every nation, well, every functioning society needs a set of rules. We call it a constitution. It's that foundational document that, lays out the law, the order, the process. But if we reduce it to just a list of legal statutes, I think we miss its true powerful function. What if we told you that the most important rulebook a nation has isn't just about defining legal authority, but about something far deeper, far more challenging, something like establishing and enforcing moral, structural, and institutional discipline?
That concept of discipline it's exactly the unique lens we're using today. The idea that a constitution isn't just permissive, it's also prescriptive and, maybe most importantly, restraining. We're diving into an incredibly ambitious source, one that crosses boundaries most political science texts, frankly, wouldn't dare to touch.
We're looking at excerpts from a sprawling philosophical and intensely personal work called The Legend Mind, From
Okay.
Zero to Infinity. It's authored by Sonu Kumar, who also goes by the SKR, or simply Legend.
And the context here is absolutely critical. I mean, it tells you right away that the author is coming at political governance from a place of deep philosophical seeking. He calls it an interdisciplinary approach. And he's not kidding. He weaves together science, math, religious philosophy, idioms, physics, even numberology and cosmology.
All to answer what he calls life's most curious questions. So this is not your standard political treatise, not at all.
No, it's an attempt to find a kind of universal truth and then apply that truth to the nation state.
And you see that right away in the dedication, which is really telling. The book is dedicated to my immortal guru, the Lord Shiva, and it's inspired by his primordial lifestyle.
Yes, and that seems to be the core philosophical driver.
Yeah.
The author says this inspiration drove him to seek zero attraction of the world and to live alone to find these foundational answers.
So just think about that for a second.
Exactly. The same quest for deep internal realization, for mastery over the self. That same philosophical rigor is what he's applying to the messy, often chaotic world of national politics.
Okay, so our mission today is to take that very high philosophical bar and see how it applies to a practical political framework. We're focusing on Unit 3, which the author titles The Five Diamonds of Nations in Earth.
Right. And these five diamonds, he lists them as the Constitution, kids, youth, population, and nature, are presented as these fundamental, non-negotiable pillars for any kind of enduring national development.
And we're zeroing in on Chapter 29, Constitution as Discipline of Nations.
Hmm.
The core statement seems deceptively simple. A constitution serves as a discipline for a nation. Our goal is to unpack what that really means. How does a document transform into a form of continuous enforced discipline that controls both the government and the populace?
And how does it help a nation achieve something like the author's zero attraction of the world, but applied to power and chaos?
Right.
That's the ultimate question. The source really defines this constitutional discipline as a whole system, a system designed to counter our natural human tendencies toward chaos, self-interest, and the abuse of power. It's a mechanism for societal self-mastery.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we're looking at the Constitution as the ultimate national discipline, we're moving way beyond just simple legalism. This sounds more like a mandated behavioral and structural framework, less like a user manual and more like a governing principle.
That's a great way to put it.
So let's start with the most obvious target for that discipline, the political actors themselves.
Historically, if you look at any collective endeavor, a company, a family, a nation, the biggest threats are always the unpredictable nature of power and that temptation toward arbitrary rule. The source argues that the first core disciplinary function of a constitution is to hit this head on, to define and limit power, and by doing that, impose essential restraints on authority.
It's a structural discipline then. It's almost like it's designed to create friction, not necessarily efficiency.
Exactly.
Friction. Because when you look at political history, the moment power becomes centralized and unchecked, the government stops being a disciplined entity. It becomes an arbitrary one, just serving its own temporary interests.
Right. And that initial discipline is just structural clarity. When a political community is forming, the biggest initial risk, as the source implies, is ambiguity.
Who gets to decide?
Who decides? How do they decide? If that's unclear, every single political action is contested. And that leads inevitably to structural chaos. So the Constitution steps in. It disciplines the exercise of power by clearly defining who holds it, how it's used, and critically, how it's limited.
Okay, so it starts with structuring government institutions. This is about laying out the basic architecture of the state, making sure governance happens through recognized, legitimate channels. It's trying to prevent what the source just calls chaos.
Yes, and the source details that classic structural discipline.
Yeah.
The triumvirate.
The three branches.
The three branches. You have the legislature, which is disciplined to the process of making laws, the executive, which is disciplined to the task of implementing them, and the judiciary, which is disciplined to interpreting them. This simple assignment of labor, this institutional clarity, is the first and most fundamental layer of discipline.
And that's such a powerful idea because, on the surface, defining who makes the laws seems kind of obvious. But just imagine a political environment where the leader, the executive, could also just invent the rules, so legislate,
Mm-hmm.
and then also judge their own adherence to those rules, the judiciary. That scenario just instantly collapses into chaos and tyranny.
Precisely. By forcing governance through these distinct, predictable channels, the Constitution ensures the whole process is legitimate. If you don't have that structure, if the executive tries to make laws without any legislative input, the action is uncertain, it's illegitimate, and it just invites conflict.
So the discipline of the structure requires you to stick to the path.
Even when that path is cumbersome, yes.
Okay, so that structural discipline is just the setup. But the real genius and the core disciplinary action the author seems to emphasize comes in how these parts interact, and that's a separation of power and checks and balances. This is the mechanism that actually enforces the limitation.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is where we can link back to the author's philosophical starting point. The source highlights this division as the core disciplinary mechanism against the concentration of power. If the author himself is seeking zero attraction of the world, this structure is seeking zero attraction of absolute power.
Yeah.
It's a system designed to use political ambition against itself.
It's institutional friction. I like that word. You're using the power of one branch as a constant check on the power of the others. The system is intentionally designed to slow the whole process of governance down, to make sure that significant power is only used after deliberation and, some kind of mutual consent.
Think about the practical examples the source brings up. Judicial review, the executive veto, legislative oversight. These aren't just ornamental procedures. They are active disciplinary tools. A legislative body, for instance, can't just pass a bill and expect it to become law if the chief executive believes it overreaches. The executive can use the veto power. So the legislature is disciplined by the mere awareness of the veto. It forces them to draft laws that are more likely to get consensus.
But let me introduce a point of critical friction here, because this discipline isn't without a cost, right?
Right.
If constitutional discipline forces delay and division, how can a disciplined nation respond quickly to a sudden existential crisis? I mean, a pandemic, a rapid economic collapse, a sudden invasion. Is the author's concept of discipline maybe too rigid for rapid, necessary action?
That is a fundamental tension in any constitutional system, and the source, I think, implicitly addresses it by emphasizing legitimacy over speed. Authoritarian regimes can respond really fast because their power is unified, but the actions they take lack the discipline of accountability. A constitutional system, while slower, insists that even crisis measures have to be debated, justified, and ultimately reviewed, maybe by the courts later on, to ensure they don't fundamentally undermine the constitutional discipline itself. That delay, that's the price you pay for enforced legitimacy.
So the discipline isn't speed. The discipline is accountability. It discourages arbitrary rule because the government has to constantly look over its shoulder, not just at the people, but at its own structural siblings. Power has to be justified, debated, and approved through multiple, sometimes conflicting channels.
And that deliberate friction is really the heart of enduring constitutional governance. It makes governing harder, it makes it slower, and ultimately it makes it more accountable. The source really underscores that by enforcing this delay and division, the system actively prevents the kind of unchecked unity and speed that authoritarianism thrives on. It disciplines the ambition of the ruler by forcing them into a collective framework.
Which brings us to the ultimate discipline imposed on the powerful. The Constitution as higher law. The idea that it stands above ordinary laws, above political platforms, and even above the government of the day.
This is the critical philosophical leap. This is what elevates the Constitution beyond a simple rule book to a moral and legal supreme authority. The government is not sovereign. The Constitution is. The source explicitly says that no law, no policy, no action by any state organ can violate its provisions. This is the disciplinary muzzle placed on the most powerful institution in the nation.
Just imagine the stakes here. A ruling party, maybe they've just won a massive electoral majority. They might feel they have the mandate to pass any law they want, but the Constitution steps in and says, well, your mandate is temporary and it's subservient to this foundational document.
And the enforcement mechanism for this is non-negotiable. If a law violates the Constitution, courts, especially constitutional courts, using judicial review, could just strike it down. The simple act of judicial review means that the government's carefully crafted legislation can just be nullified if it steps outside the boundary of that foundational discipline. It's an intellectual and legal safeguard.
This is where we see the concept of legal discipline really in action. It establishes the rule of law. It means even the most powerful actors, the majority party, the executive, are always subject to a higher foundational authority. The Constitution disciplines them by treating them as temporary servants of the document, not its masters. If they step out of line, the structure itself, the very system they govern, forces them back into line. This continuous imposition of restraint on authority, that's the very definition of a stable political discipline.
So if the first section was about applying discipline to the ruler, creating structural order, this next part is about applying discipline to the ruled, or maybe, more accurately, creating the necessary framework for a cohesive, shared political life. The Constitution disciplines society by defining the nation itself, its boundaries, its core values, and the procedures for collective life.
This is all about defining the community, which is, often a really contested space. Without a disciplined definition, society just risks constant fragmentation. So the Constitution steps in and provides the fundamental definition of us. Let's look at how it does that through defining political boundaries.
This is so foundational, and it's a necessary discipline. The Constitution specifies the territorial extent of the state, where the jurisdiction of the collective ends. But just as importantly, it defines who belongs to the state through clear citizenship provisions. Without this definition, the political body becomes, as the source puts it, ambiguous or contested.
The legal clarity here is immense. I mean, just imagine the lack of discipline in a society where citizenship is totally arbitrary or undefined. It creates instability, internal conflict, constant fights over who gets what.
Yeah.
The Constitution disciplines this ambiguity by just drawing a precise legal line in the sand. This is the nation. These are its citizens. The community is then disciplined to accept this shared definition.
And this territorial discipline has massive implications for external relations, too. A disciplined nation has clear borders, which helps create stable international relations. If your boundaries are always shifting, or if you can't even define who your citizens are, you can't really exercise national power effectively or predictably.
It provides coherence.
The discipline of definition provides coherence, both internally and externally.
Yes. So once you define the territory and the people, the next step of discipline has to be defining what us stands for. That's articulating national identity and core values. This sets the moral and ideological boundaries for what we do together, for collective political action.
Right, and many listeners might look at constitutional preambles or those foundational clauses, the commitments to democracy, secularism, equality, social justice, and see them as just symbolic, lofty statements that don't really govern day-to-day life. But the source argues they are absolutely central to the Constitution's disciplinary role.
They're the ethical compass. If the structural limits we talked about are the mechanical brake pads, these values are the moral navigation system. They're not just symbolic. They serve as guiding principles that actively shape legislation, policy, and public discourse. This is the discipline of having a consistent principle.
Think of it this way. Political actors are disciplined by these established moral boundaries. They can't just do what's politically convenient or what a temporary majority wants. They have to make sure their actions align with the core, entrenched values of the Constitution. It imposes a long-term discipline on transient political whims.
So, for instance, if a nation's constitution has this deep commitment to social justice, any proposed law that clearly makes poverty or inequality worse, it might be challenged. Not just on procedural grounds, but on the grounds that it violates the fundamental disciplinary value set of the nation.
Absolutely. The discipline here is a moral one. It reinforces the idea that collective action has to adhere to a shared framework that was established at the founding. It limits the ideological drift of temporary majorities and forces them to reconcile their goals with the enduring identity of the nation. It disciplines the collective imagination, in a way. It insists that the national project remains true to its stated ethos.
Which leads us to maybe the most vital and practical form of societal discipline, providing a peaceful mechanism for political change. I mean, conflict is inevitable, right? In any diverse, dynamic society, it is. So the Constitution has to manage it without fracturing the whole community.
The alternative is anarchy. The source points out that without this discipline, society risks resorting to violence, coups, or what it calls mob rule. The Constitution establishes orderly, predictable processes for the most high-stakes political actions, elections, leadership transitions, policy debates. The discipline here is just mandatory adherence to process over impulse or raw force.
It's about channeling conflict effectively. Ambition, disagreement, social conflict. These are natural forces. They're the energy of politics. The Constitution disciplines this energy by forcing it into lawful, predictable forms: voting, parliamentary debate, judicial appeals. It tells dissenters, your frustration is valid, but your method for addressing it has to follow the agreed-upon rules.
It creates a pressure release valve of immense stability. Instead of taking disagreements to the streets with weapons or forming militias, the Constitution insists they be taken to the ballot box or the courtroom. This is an immense stabilizing discipline placed on dissent itself. It says, you have the right to dissent, but you must use the agreed-upon tools of the state to effect change.
And the collective discipline of following those procedures, even when your side loses, that's what keeps the peace.
It's profound because it applies to everyone. If the leader loses an election, they have to submit to the established process of transition. If a policy is deeply unpopular, the opponents have to use the Constitutional Tools Amendment, repeal, judicial challenge, rather than illegal force to change it.
Without this constant, quiet discipline, society is always one major dispute away from anarchy or civil war.
Yeah. It allows for political life to become a marathon, not just a series of sprints to capture ultimate power. The discipline of change ensures that tomorrow's government is fundamentally the same system as today's government, even if the ideology is radically different.
And that consistency is paramount to long-term national health. So we've talked about disciplining the structural power of the ruler and the cohesive identity of society. Now we shift to the individual level. We're examining the contract between the ruled and the ruler. The Constitution disciplines this relationship by establishing a mutual contract, one that balances rights and responsibilities.
This is the most personal form of discipline, really, because it governs your direct, moment-to-moment interaction with the state. The relationship has to be structured and limited for the citizen to trust the state and for the state to trust the citizen.
The source identifies 3 ways this relationship is disciplined, and it starts with protecting fundamental rights. These rights, freedom of speech, equality before the law, protection from arbitrary arrest, they aren't just gifts from the government. They are effectively the mechanisms for disciplining state behavior.
Right. When a constitution enshrines these rights, it places non-negotiable legal limits on state power. It draws a clear legal red line around the autonomy of the individual. It delivers a specific disciplinary message to the government, something like, you may govern, but you shall not tyrannize. This is the ultimate expression of the state disciplining itself by creating enforceable limits on its own actions.
You can think of this protection as constitutional armor. For you, the listener, this is crucial. The power dynamic is always skewed towards the state. It has a monopoly on force. So rights serve as the balance. They provide the legal weapon for individuals to hold authorities accountable when those limits are crossed. The threat of a legal challenge that the state might actually lose in its own courts because it violated the foundational discipline, that's a continuous behavioral check on state agents.
And that constitutional armor is crucial for political stability. When citizens know their rights are protected by a higher law, they're more likely to submit to the discipline of the state in other areas, because they trust that the system won't fundamentally betray them.
Trust is the foundation of discipline.
Exactly.
But the relationship isn't just one-sided. The individual can't just take the benefits of the stable system without, contributing to its maintenance. This is the crucial counterpoint, outlining civic duties. The Constitution disciplines the individual by instilling a sense of collective responsibility.
The source is very clear on this. Freedom comes with obligations. It lists specific, often challenging duties: obeying laws, paying taxes, defending the nation, and, maybe the most abstract one, promoting harmony. And this is where the political framework connects most deeply with the author's whole philosophical quest for zero attraction.
That's a fascinating link. If the author's ultimate goal is personal mastery overcoming self-interest, the attraction of the world, then civic duties demand that the citizen performs a miniature version of that every day. Paying taxes is often against your immediate self-interest, but it's necessary for the collective good. Promoting harmony requires overcoming partisan or individual grievances for the sake of national cohesion.
Exactly. These duties instill a necessary sense of collective responsibility. They remind citizens that national unity and progress depend on responsible, ethical conduct from all members of society. The Constitution disciplines selfishness and atomization by making individual contribution mandatory for the system's survival. If everyone demands their rights but refuses their duties, if no one pays taxes or upholds harmony, the system collapses. The foundation of discipline just erodes.
This is the Constitution acting as a moral instructor. It's balancing individual liberty with the often harsh demands of community cohesion. It disciplines the populace by reminding them that they aren't just beneficiaries but active participants and maintainers of the system.
And finally, to make this entire disciplinary system credible, you need a consequence structure. That is, creating a framework for justice and redress. Breaches of the social contract, by either the state or the citizen, have to have predictable, lawful consequences.
Right. If the rules are arbitrary, discipline just evaporates. If the state violates your freedom of speech, the Constitution provides the mechanisms for redress, access to courts, human rights commissions. And if a citizen ignores their duty, say, by committing a crime, the state uses the constitutional judicial process to enforce consequences.
This predictability is what reinforces the disciplinary function so immensely. If a citizen tries to bypass the discipline mechanism for change we talked about and commits violence, the justice framework provides the authoritative response. If the most powerful state agent commits an arbitrary arrest, the courts provide the individual with a remedy. This framework prevents the breakdown of trust and ensures that the system, even when it's challenged, remains authoritative and coherent.
So it's the final guarantor of discipline.
It disciplines the entire system by proving that the foundational rules matter equally to the most powerful official and the average citizen. When people know the consequence for breaking the rules is predictable and lawful, they are far more likely to adhere to the discipline itself.
The moment consequences become arbitrary or depend on political favor, the discipline is lost, and the system just reverts to the law of the jungle.
So we've dissected how the Constitution acts as a disciplinarian on three distinct levels: the structural authority, the collective society, and the individual relationship with the state. Now we have to bring this powerful concept full circle, which is what the author does in the synthesis.
The source clearly says that calling the Constitution a discipline really underscores its role. It's not just a static legal document, but a living, dynamic framework that actively manages our continuous human tendency toward political and social chaos.
It's the ultimate structure built to anticipate and manage human frailty, tyranny, fragmentation, and self-interest. Let's quickly review the 4 key outcomes of this continuous constitutional discipline. The source summarizes them, and these are the direct benefits for you, the listener.
Okay, the first outcome is fundamental. It imposes order on potentially chaotic political and social forces. I mean, chaos is the natural state of large, diverse populations without structure. The constitutional framework provides the structure, the rules of engagement, and the referees to prevent that natural entropy from taking hold.
Second, and this is crucial for stability, it ensures consistency in governance across time and leadership changes. The Constitution outlasts the politician. It means that even if a charismatic leader with a radically different vision takes power, they still have to operate within the established disciplined framework of checks and balances and core values. This discipline ensures the state itself doesn't suffer a personality disorder every time a new leader is elected.
The third outcome is accountability, and it's brilliantly dual-sided. It demands accountability from both rulers and the ruled. The government is accountable for upholding rights. The citizens are accountable for fulfilling duties. This mutual responsibility is what maintains the integrity of the social contract. Without it, accountability is just a one-way street, which leads either to tyranny if the state isn't accountable, or anarchy if the citizens aren't.
And the fourth outcome speaks directly to the reality of modern political life. It channels diversity and dissent into constructive, lawful avenues rather than destructive conflict. It gives every voice, every minority, every disgruntled group a legitimate, predictable, and nonviolent way to participate and influence the national direction. This is maybe the greatest discipline of all, teaching a diverse population how to disagree without destroying the foundational structures they all share.
And the stakes here are existential, which makes the author's perspective highly dramatic. The source warns that without this discipline, a nation risks a triad of failure: fragmentation, authoritarianism, or anarchy. So this constitutional framework is the active force that combats that collapse.
And the conclusion, when you view it through the author's philosophical lens, is really powerful. The Constitution is more than a set of rules. It's the moral and institutional backbone of a stable, just, and cohesive society. It acts as a powerful moral force, setting the limits of acceptable behavior for both the state and the citizen. And it's driven by that same high-minded quest for universal order that the author pursues through cosmology.
So what does this all mean for you? The Constitution doesn't just grant power. It actively manages the human tendency to abuse it, both in government and in the populace. It disciplines power to serve the people, and it disciplines the people to uphold the values that make their nation worth preserving. It's a constant enforced lesson in self-governance and good citizenship, ensuring that the political system maintains that elusive zero attraction to chaos and unchecked power.
This deep dive into the legend mind has given us a completely unique, almost spiritual perspective on what's usually considered a purely technical legal document. We've mapped out three primary ways the Constitution acts as a disciplinarian: by limiting state power through structural checks and balances, by creating a stable national identity through shared values, and by balancing individual rights with corresponding civic duties.
The strength of this philosophical approach, which mixes political science with this broader cosmological and moral seeking, is that it really elevates the Constitution. It's not just a legal contract, it's an essential living discipline required for long-term national health.
And as we mentioned at the very start, the source positions the Constitution as only one of the five diamonds of nations. It establishes the rule set, the discipline, the blueprint.
The other diamonds he lists are kids, which the author calls the seed of nations, youth, identified as the weapon of nations, population, the money of nations, and nature, the wealth of nations.
Which introduces a fascinating challenge. If the Constitution provides the discipline, the instruction manual for behavior and structure, what role do these other four diamonds play in upholding that discipline, or in just making the system functional at all?
Let's unpack that for a final provocative thought. The Constitution is abstract. These other four diamonds are concrete, living resources. If the youth are the weapon of nations, they represent energy, action, and future power. So how must this weapon be disciplined, not suppressed, but channeled to serve the constitutional values rather than destroy the constitutional limits?
Similarly, the population is defined as the money of nations, the collective human capital and potential. How must that population be disciplined in its civic duties, in its adherence to the rule of law, to ensure that the constitutional system remains solvent and functional? It suggests that constitutional discipline is only sustainable if the human resources of the nation are internally disciplined as well.
And this thought is for you, the listener, to consider for future study. The discipline of the document is only as strong as the discipline of the diamonds that support it. The system requires constant, active maintenance by the people it governs.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us into the nature of national discipline and the extraordinary synthesizing insights of the legend mind. We'll catch you next time.
And in the tradition of the author's philosophical closing, JAIGURUDEV,